Good evening, friends, and welcome to another edition of Friday Forum. It is fitting that we talk about the work of Homai Vyarawalla today because it's Gandhi Jayanti, and Homai was the person who photographed Gandhiji right through the freedom movement and partition. We welcome Sabeena Gadihoke, professor at Jamia Millia, and a very dear friend, as well as, of course, Homai's adopted daughter. Welcome, Sabeena,
Thank you.
and I hope you're going to enjoy this show as much as we are going to
Sure.
enjoy having you with us. I'm going to start by telling you about how we discovered Homai Vyarewala. I had never heard of her name. And when I was doing my field trips and I was planning to go to Baroda, Dhan Bagli at the Delhi Parsi Anjuman, who today has known the Parsis of Delhi for 60 years, just met me at the Agyari, where she was the manager, and told me, "You're going to Baroda, you have to meet Homai Vyarewala." So I said, "Why?" And then Bagli said, "I'm not going to tell you, discover it for yourself." Well, that was very nice, very easy, I thought. So I phoned up our dear friend, the late Professor Rumi Mistry, who, like Dhananti, knew in Delhi, knew every Baroda Parsi. And I said, "Please, how do I fix up my appointment with Homai Vyarewala?" He said, "Who?" And there it started. But sure enough, when we landed up at Baroda, the second day we were interviewing people at the Baroda Anjuman because we had a long list of people to cover in a very short time. And Hemant and Dushyant Mehta of the Mahata's studio were with me, as was my father, the late General Setna. We started talking to Homai, a very quiet, nondescript type of woman sitting in the hall while we were interviewing others. And suddenly, Dushyant Mehta said, "Oh my God, this is the Homai Vyarewala." And the two boys went crazy. I began listening to her stories and I turned around and said, "How do you not have a book?" And she said, "I've been waiting my whole life for somebody to ask me that question." And that started a long journey. She said, "There's somebody called Sabeena. Do you know her in Delhi?" I said, "No, I don't know Sabeena." And she said, "Well, Sabeena says she wants to write my book. Will you publish my book?" I said, "Obviously, I'll publish your book. You are just absolutely amazing. Look at the stories you've got." And she turns around and says, "Well, lots of people have told me that, but no book ever came out." And that's how this book, India in Focus, Camera Chronicles of Homai Vyarewala, was first brought out by Parzor, and then a second edition came out with the Al-Qazi Foundation and the NGMA, and we've had so many exhibitions, so many travels with her, so many Kabadiwala stories, everything that Sabeena is going to tell you. This is a picture which Jahangir Patel took at the launch of the book. He said it was almost impossible to get the three women to sit down for a minute or to stand together for a minute and get a photograph. And I thank Jahangir Patel for this because this is a very happy picture of the three of us together. Sabeena, would you like to tell us your story about Homai and her travels?
Yeah. Thanks, Shernaz. So, my story with Homai began a little earlier, and it was almost running parallel, I guess. But I had first made a film on Homai Vyarawalla in 1998. So, in 1997, a photographer called Satish Sharma, and I always give him credit because if he had not told me about Homai, I wouldn't know who she was. And he had actually discovered her in a list of names of the Press Information Bureau, of photographers, and he had noticed a Mrs. Vyarawalla written there. So in 1993, he went to meet her in Baroda, and he organized an exhibition of her work at the Gate Institute in Delhi. And I had heard about her, but I didn't know very much. So I was making a film about three photographers, two younger women, and I I just decided that I need to have her in the film. So I took her address from Sati Sharma, went to Baroda, just landed up there because Homai did not even have a phone. And I landed up at her house in 1997. We made the film in 1998. We're just going to show you a clip from the film, but before that, I just want to complete the story. And after I made the film, because it was a film about three women, films are very limited because they can do things that books can't, but books can do things that films can't. So in the film, there was just 18 minutes of time given to Homai, and there was so much of her life. I was so fascinated by her life that I felt that it just didn't do justice to her. So I started going back to Baroda. Every few months I'd take a train and I'd go to Baroda and I'd carry a little audio cassette recorder and I would just record these stories. And I still remember those wonderful days where Homai, who was this fabulous cook, would make dhansak and mango ice cream and her famous fish curry. And then she'd be working in the kitchen and I'd be looking at the photographs and then I'd run to the kitchen and she'd say, "Okay, I'll tell you the story." And she'd come back, settle down because she had a major problem with her back, and basically, the history of a century would unfold in front of me because when I met her, she was 84. And of course, when she passed away, she was 99. And there was so much of history to tell and so much of history that this woman had lived through. So, the clip we're going to see now is from Three Women and a Camera, where she's showing you and demonstrating to you her speed graphic camera. And it was before I go into the clip, just want to say, very heavy camera. You will see that for yourself. But also remember that this was a different moment of photography when you could only take 8 or 12 clicks at one go. And so you had to be very measured. It's very different. I don't think people who shoot with the digital can even imagine what it would be like because we are so used to just endlessly clicking. But it had to be a very deliberate form of photography. You had to really compose because you only had 8 or 12 exposures. So she will talk about that. I mean, she will show you her camera in the next clip.
Holding the camera like this, I can keep both my eyes open and just look through like that. So I can see whatever is happening in that particular frame at the same time what is happening around me. Then this is another viewfinder which I can use, which shows only the framing of the picture. And the focusing is done here, just like that, forward and backwards. So all in a hurry, I had just to shift this, take the picture, without any bother about focusing. And my pictures always used to come out proper focus. And after every shot, had to open this, remove the bulb, put it back, put another one. And I used to carry my camera like this on my shoulder, always. So this used to become the ashtray for the people, more or less.
So I wonder whether you caught that. She said that flash bulb that area used to become the ashtray for the photographers. Okay, Shernaz, do you want to talk? I mean, do you want me to speak about this photograph, which is
I
a very
would.
special
This
one?
is a very
Yeah,
special photograph, and I
yeah,
think it's very important that today, being Gandhi Jayanti, you need to talk about both the Gandhis here, the frontier Gandhi and Gandhiji, and the whole
yes,
following scenes. Thank you.
yes. So this was Gandhi was somebody that she photographed a lot, but ironically, Gandhi hated the flash. And he once said, "Ki jab tak ye mujhe andha nahi bana degi, she will not rest." So they had to be very careful when they were photographing Gandhi because he didn't particularly like being photographed, unlike Nehru. And what is very ironic is that actually Homai photographed him a lot more after he passed away because she photographed his funeral and she photographed, the ceremonies after that. Now, this is a photograph where Gandhi, accompanied by the frontier Gandhi, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and Sushila Nair, who was his personal physician, are going for a very important and a very decisive meeting of the Congress Working Committee on the 14th of June. And this was a meeting to ratify the 3rd June plan to partition the country, which had been worked out with Mountbatten. And if you move to the next image, Mahtab, we'll see people voting for partition. So you see Nehru, you see Indira, you see all the major people, and you see Rajendra Prasad, you see a lot of people that we recognize. And people had to, by a show of hands, put up their hands for partition, even in the next one as well. If you move to the next slide. And Gandhiji was, of course, very unhappy. But there wasn't very much they could do about it. It's interesting that these images didn't circulate as much in public memory, even though one or two of them I've seen them printed up in certain newspapers and magazines. But I think they were overshadowed by the more by the images of trauma, by the images of pain of partition. So we don't really see these images as much. And I think this was a very important event that she actually photographed. And of course, she had to we are told that Acharya Kripalani, who was in the chair, didn't want photographers there. So she and Kulwant Roy, another press photographer, had to kind of dodge behind and take these pictures. So that's a top angle view of Gandhi's body lying in state, and with Sushila Nair. In fact, actually, she was out of town, and then she came back, and so that's the body before it was taken for the cremation. And the next photograph, I think, is the one at the grounds of the cremation ground, where you see the Mountbattens, basically Lord and Lady Mountbatten, and the two daughters with Rajkumari Amrit Kaur sitting on the ground at the cremation. And then the next image, where you see, so his ashes were then taken by a train to Allahabad for immersion at Sangam. And here you see crowds at every station running along with the train to catch a last glimpse of Gandhi. Okay, now we come back to Homai's childhood and her growing up. Homai was born in a very modest family in Navsari, to a priestly family. Her father was an actor in a traveling Urdu Parsi theatre company. So he traveled all over the world, and her early years was spent, and it was the second marriage of her mother and her father. So both of them were married for the second time. So Sunamai, her mother, you see that photograph on the right hand side, where you see Homai with her mother Sunamai, very simple person who kind of weave the kasti, and she'd actually weave the thread. And so basically she grew up in this very ordinary, almost poor actually family. And on the left hand side was their house in Dhobi Talao, their first house, where the five of them lived in one house, and even the kitchen and the bathroom was in the same room, so it was just one room. And it is from here that Homai would go to she would actually travel to the Grant Road school to study. So the early years were spent traveling all over Rangoon and parts of Malaysia, because she would just travel with the father, and as part of this troop, the mother and Homai would travel. And it's only after a certain time that they settled down. The mother and the two brothers and Homai settled down in Bombay, while the father continued to send money home. And of course, he came back very sick and he died. But so they lived a very hand to mouth existence. They grew up, she grew up with just 6 saris between her mother and her. And she often talks about how, she'd innovate with different kinds of blouses, and she'd keep changing the border. She says it was my job every weekend to wash the saris and to change the border so that the sari would look different. And that's a photograph of her with her mother. And this is her photograph with her boyfriend, Manisha, with whom she went out for almost 13 years before getting married. And I often used to tease her about it and say that, was it sanctioned by your mother? And she said my mother completely trusted him and really liked him. And so finally she gets married to Maniksha. That's a photograph of her photographing at Chowpatty in the middle of the water. And this is a lovely picture of the two of them, which I actually have a glass plate negative of, because she actually presented me with the glass plate negative. So this is the time when these were early days, and you didn't have a negative, you had a glass plate negative. And she got married to him and then followed him in 1941 to Delhi. Shernaz, I'm going to ask you to comment on these two pictures.
Picture. This is the Variaji Atas Beram. I think this is a beautiful picture. There are many pictures of Homai photographing Parsis, both in Navsari, women doing chalk, women carrying the sais, things like that. I mean, we can talk for hours about all the different aspects of Homai Vyarawalla. And this, she captures the, I think, the fluidity of the movement in the Vadiyaji Atas Beram picture is beautiful. And she looks so proud and happy as she's watching this young boy's Navjot. The tragedy is that this mother had to outlive her son by decades. And this is something which I think affected her deeply. Next, please, for Mother. This is
Yeah.
something again very interesting. I'm going to let Sabeena talk about it. The only thing I want to remind you all is that the Bombay Chronicle and the Illustrated Weekly, the Bombay Chronicle in particular, had great editors like Brailby and then later on Horniman, after whom Horniman Circle is named. And these spreads were, I think, the first real photo spreads of and photojournalism in India. And there's one very fascinating picture which even today seems unbelievable that it could happen in a place like Navsari. And I'd like Sabeena to please comment upon the Tadi picture.
Yeah. So, she'd go around. So, this is the early part of her work where she'd go around photographing things in Bombay and around and the outskirts of Bombay. So, in the previous spread, of course, you had all these different, she was like this wandering photographer who just take things off the street. And, this was also the time of the Second World War where India was supporting the British, as patriots. And this is a picture taken of all of them drinking toddy, and Homai is actually the one who's being given the toddy in Navsari. And it's quite an incredible picture because, to show women drinking at that point in time is quite incredible. I mean, here these women are dressed in saris and, dressed in their Parsi kind of look. They have a Parsi kind of a look. And yet it was such a liberated and a community. And I think that a lot of, and I will come to that a little later, that I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that Homai belonged to the Parsi community. I can't imagine somebody. I don't imagine. I mean, we don't know, of course, because there was no other professional woman photographer in her time. But it's difficult to imagine somebody to go out and have, a kind of an unrestricted access to the public arena. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that Homai was Parsi. So this is again a cover from the Bombay Chronicle, and this is called A Silent Tear. And it's now, interestingly, it's credited to M.J. Vyarawalla, which is the name of her husband. But in the early days, both the Illustrated Weekly and the Bombay Chronicle, her name was not given. So they were credited to her husband. And this is one of her most famous subjects, Rehana Mughal, and I'm hoping that her son is actually here. I had asked him to be on this, talk because I wanted him to see this. It's a beautiful photograph, and Rehana actually passed away just a few years ago. And I missed meeting her in Goa. She lived in Goa, and with her son Shahid. And Rihanna was somebody that was her colleague. I mean, she was actually somebody she studied with at the JD School of Arts. This absolutely stunning woman. She was from the Bohra Muslim community. And this is a picture of Rihanna on the cover of the Bombay Chronicle. Now, what I want to point out to you is something very interesting. It says a silent tear, right? And so it's kind of this very performative picture. So Homai, of course, is known for her very candid work, as a press photographer. But she was also a master of the performed photograph. And what I do want to point out to you is that, while Rehana's head is covered, she's got lipstick on, she's got a very fashionable, she's got this crinkled hair. And so it's also about the modern young woman. And I will talk a little bit about that when we go a little later into the presentation.
Sabeena, I'd like you to comment on the next picture, which I think is really remarkable considering the date and considering the women and the male model. I really would like you to talk about this because even today, I wonder if today we'd be allowed to take a picture like this.
It's quite an incredible photograph, and Homai studied at the JD School of Arts, which of course we know was a colonial, institution. So it was a pre-independence. It was a very old institution, and she learned art and she also learned photography. So Rehana was also studying art and sculpture, and this is quite an amazing photograph because you can see Mani Turner, the other friend at the back, kind of measuring, his leg. and this man standing there, and the roles are, the gaze is completely, I mean, we always see women as the objects for men taking photographs of women in states of undress. But I think this is quite an incredible picture, and here you have this male model and this these two women actually. So I think it's a photograph with a lot of agency for me. And there again is Rihanna at a picnic in at the Ambernath temple in close to Bombay. And again, you can see it's a very performed picture. She's put her sari like a Roman toga. She's got her legs, kind of displayed, and she's posing, like a film star would. And I find this very interesting.
Sabina, isn't it interesting that you have a Parsi woman and a Bora Muslim woman being able to move around with this type of freedom? I think that it gives us a lot of lessons to think about in today's day and age, and particularly today.
Absolutely, absolutely. It goes without saying. I mean, it's a different moment, and I don't know whether one could actually do this today. I mean, it would be a different moment today. Absolutely, I agree with you.
Thanks, Madhav.
Okay, we move to another part of her work and another part of her life, which is that. So the pictures we were seeing earlier were pictures that she took in Bombay in the late 1930s and early 1940s. And now by 1941, she has moved to Delhi to join her husband, who has a job with the Far Eastern Bureau, which is like the publicity wing of the British government during the war, during the Second World War. This becomes the British Information Services after independence and then becomes the British High Commission. So she's actually, her employers are the British. The husband has a job there and she's given a job along with him. But interestingly, the roles get reversed after a while. Manik Shah stays back to process the pictures in the dark room, and Homai is the one who actually goes out to photograph. And this is a photograph. So now the reason why I wanted to take you through one or two of these photographs is because these are her absolutely iconic pictures that we've kind of, we know these as historical images, but sometimes we don't know who took them. And these are very famous images. So we've got the Mountbattens, Mountbatten, Lord Mountbatten giving his last salute before he left the country in 1948 with Edwina. We've got the 15th of August, 1947. The crowds this is after the unfurling of the flag at Red Fort, and then the crowds later, at Vijay Chowk, and people in the buggy, I mean, the leaders in the buggy with Lord Mountbatten and Nehru past Vijay Chowk.
Sabina, may I interrupt you there? My father was
Yes,
riding. Can we go back? My father was riding
yes.
in that white pith hat by the
Wow.
side of this buggy. And
Wonderful.
continue, please. Yeah.
And this is the first Republic Day taken from the top of India Gate, 1951. Now, we became a republic in 1950. So, very often people say this is 1950, you got the date wrong. No. 1950, the Republic Day was held at the Purana Killa. And it was in 1951 that you had the parade here. And Homai climbed up to the top of the India Gate. You can't imagine a photographer being allowed to do that now. Of course, now we have drones, and so you don't need to do that. But for security reasons, I don't think anybody can go to the top of India Gate. But she did. She clambered up the top and she took this photograph. And here is her
Yeah.
favorite subject.
Yeah.
Here is her favorite subject. So, if we are talking about Gandhi as somebody who hated the flash and who didn't like being photographed, here were two very famous men. Here is another famous man who actually liked being photographed, extremely camera friendly, and actually posed for the photograph. So, here you have Nehru standing probably deliberately next to photography, strictly prohibited, so that she can take a picture. He was extremely fond of Homai. They had a very good rapport, and and also we have to also remember that this was a different moment of photography when the distance between the photographer and the leader, you didn't have security issues. I think that started with Mrs. Gandhi, but it was a different moment of photography, a more, I don't like using the word innocent, but a different time. It was a different time.
Sabina, could you tell us where that photograph was and
So
why?
that was
What is
taken,
that
yeah. So
followers?
that these are actually companion pictures. That was taken in 1954. He's waiting at Safdarjung Airport for his sister to arrive. His sister, who is the ambassador in the USSR in Russia, and this is Homai's favorite photograph. And she says that for me, it's not a photograph of the prime minister hugging the ambassador to the Soviet Union. It's just an ordinary picture of the love between a brother and a sister. And I think it's an absolutely beautiful, wonderful picture. I mean, if you look at the clouds behind and just this very spontaneous movement. So, if we are looking at the previous picture as a kind of pose picture, this for me is a very spontaneous, candid moment.
It's a lovely picture. Next, please.
And again, a very extraordinary photograph. Nehru was actually a chain smoker, and but he had to do this was, and again, it was not something that was made a big deal of like you would today. Today things would be very different. People are so much more self-conscious, but this is a photograph where he's lighting up a cigarette for Mrs. Simon, who was the wife of the deputy high commissioner to Britain, Mr. Simon, and they are on the first trial flight of the BOAC jet, and Homai traveled with them on this flight. And in the next flight, the very next flight, the plane crashed. So they were very lucky, actually.
Next, please, Mehta. Yes.
And she then goes on to photograph the nation. She photographs nation building activities. She photographs the visits of dignitaries and heads of state during the Cold War to India. And they came from all over on both sides of the Iron Curtain. So they came from, you had people like Khrushchev coming from the Soviet Union. You had Eisenhower coming from the US. You had people from all over. And this was the visit of the Queen in 1961, taken at the racecourse in Bombay. And what is very interesting about these set of pictures, we can't show you too many because of time, but the Queen noticed her because there were so many photographers shooting her, the Queen, but she was the only woman there. And the Queen kept looking in her direction and she got the best pictures. So, when people sometimes say that being a woman is a disadvantage, actually, sometimes it can be an advantage because you're the only one, and then you get these exclusive pictures because the Queen was so fascinated by the fact that there was this one woman shooting in that crowd of men that she kept looking at her.
What
Again, one of my
yes
favorite photographs. Yeah, it's one of my favorite photographs. In fact, I have it right up here next to me in my bedroom, and it is a photograph of, I would see it as a kind of a more innocent time, which is the moment in the 1950s when we talk about the pearls necklace, which is what Connaught Place was known as. You can barely see any traffic. You can see very few people, and Homai loved it. And it's a lovely day. You can see the clouds. There's no pollution. Homai, by the way, lived on the right hand side, just above. She lived on the flat above. But like all photographs, I think that every photograph masks a story that is not always very pleasant. And there are stories that spill over the borders of a particular frame. And I think that the other story that goes with this photograph is not very nice. And that is that during partition, um, there was whole scale rioting in very, very serious riots in Connaught Place. And mobs would often come in and throw burning rags into shops owned by Muslims because they wanted Muslims to leave and go away to the camps at Purana Killa. And Homai's landlord was a Muslim family. They had a big furniture shop below their flat. And one day a mob came and the family had to flee and go away to the camp at Purana Killa. And she says that we would stand on the terrace, pretending as if we owned the house so that people wouldn't come and destroy the house. And then one day a family came from Karachi, a Hindu family, and they forcibly occupied the house because this was the time of what was called enemy property, and they kind of took over that house, and that family was never seen again, and they had to actually go away. And it is a very sad story. It's a sad story about partition, and we know that there are so many such stories. So I think that this photograph is a lovely picture. It's a beautiful picture, but it's also a reminder of things that are outside the frame that we don't always think about.
That's so true. And these are pictures which were never shown till this book came out. You must talk about this and how Homai was able to take these photographs, again, perhaps because she was a Parsi.
Yeah.
And how she used to drive a cycle at night and go and
Yes.
take these pictures.
Right. So this is really her life. So if her mornings and her days were spent shooting political events, her evenings were spent at these expatriate parties, at the Gymkhana Club or at embassies. And this is actually the Delhi Gymkhana Club. We still have that hall actually, with the wooden floor. And you've got all these people dressed up in fancy dress. Now, fancy dress was clearly a very, very popular kind of form of leisure. And so you've got all these people dressed up in somebody else, whether it is whoever. And then, of course, you have all these dances at the Delhi Gymkhana Club. And you can see that there are Indians here as well. They're obviously very elite and they are from, the Indian Administrative Service. And in some ways, these photographs taken in the 1950s and 60s almost are, it almost makes it seem like there was nothing else happening, whereas actually there was a lot happening that was disturbing in the country by the 1960s. So for instance, by the 1960s, there were language riots, there were religious riots, there was Nehru was gone, Patel was gone, Gandhi was gone. The cracks in the nation state had started to appear. We had fought two wars with, first with China and then with Pakistan. And these are images that kind of seem almost removed from what was happening outside.
I'd like to take
Again, a
over.
very important picture.
Yeah,
I'm going to ask you to take over.
yeah, thank you. Uh, Two people have given me the stories about this picture and about the Dalai Lama, both women whom I greatly respected. The first was Kapila Vatsyayan, and the second is Homai Vyarawalla. This picture, uh, I had never seen the Dalai Lama, who I follow all the time. I'd never seen him in his royal robes. This was the time when he was coming as a young man to the Buddhist conference at the Ashoka Hotel. And there's a remarkable picture of this young man and Chow and Lai on the same stage. This picture was taken when he came as a royal prince, and the next picture will show you what it meant to be a royal prince and the Dalai Lama of Tibet. You can see the turquoise, the huge turquoise on his crown and on his clothes, and you can still see the same very sweet smile. The next picture will tell you how the Dalai Lama had to forsake that role and how he embraced a completely new life. And I know about this because for 90 days, Kapila Vatsyayan was asked by Nehru to take the young Dalai Lama around India and look after him and introduce him to his new homeland. They were friends till Kapilaji died last month, and as she always laughed, I was his second mother, and he used to call her. He used to call out to her and say, "Mother," and they would laugh in this way. It's such a beautiful picture of Kapilaji, MGK Menon, Professor MGK Menon at the back, and of course His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Yeah. And I wanted to just before we move to this one, I wanted to also say that this particular set of photographs taken in 1956, in 1959, of course, when the Dalai Lama actually crossed over into India, there was nobody to actually witness that crossing. But in 1956, it was a trip to where she, which is full of agency because she actually traveled all by herself to Sikkim, to the Nathula Pass, and she had to hitchhike on a jeep. They didn't find a place to stay, and then they found this tiny little place. And there was this guy, another photographer called Mastram, who slept under the bed. Imagine that happening today. And she slept on the top, and then they hitchhiked with a jeep from the tea estate, and then that car broke down, and then on the way back they had to hitchhike on a truck. So it's also about her agency in taking these photographs, which is quite incredible. And the next photograph, I think here lies the story of Homai giving up photography for me when I look at it. So as I said, by the 1960s, the cracks in the nation state were beginning to appear. It was they were seeing roads being changed, being renamed. There was a new generation of very ruthless and aggressive photographers, very competitive photographers coming into the field. Homai felt that the days of what she called gentlemen photographers was gone. The people she had with her, like for instance in this photograph, Mrs. Gandhi, of course, security people had started harassing photographers. And, you can see this in this photograph. She's actually, gesturing to somebody to say, please move out of the frame because, you're coming in our frame. And I think she just decided enough was enough. And she capped what she called it capping her lens. So in 1970, she just gave up photography. Her partner had died in 1969, a year earlier. And her only son, Farooq, was by now studying in Pilani. She went to Pilani. He got a job in Pilani, and she set up home for him in Pilani. And in this sleepy little town, nobody knew who she was. Nobody knew that she had been a photographer. She discovered, or rather rediscovered, a new life. Homai, one of the most incredible things about Homai was that she never looked back. She had such a fulfilling life as a photographer. At 57, she decides to give it up. And she then becomes a homemaker for her son. But she does interesting things. She does macrame, she does stitching, she does tailoring, she does baking, she organizes, plays with the women of Pilani. She does the things that she never got a chance to do as a woman. And one of the things I asked her, I said that Mrs. Vyarawalla, how was it? And she said, when I was a photographer, I was always slightly awkward in the company of women. And I said, why? She said, because the women that I met always seemed to talk about jewelry and clothes. And she said, I was so different that I never felt comfortable with them. And this is the first time in Pilani that I felt comfortable among women because, it was a different life. And so she did gardening, she did so many other things. And I think people in Pilani realized that, she could do so much. She could build a table, she could create a table out of wood. She could build a staircase. She could even build walls. I mean, she was, she was a kind of a handy person of sorts. She could do so many things. And somewhere there's this whole very interesting story of how she was rediscovered. Some photographer or journalist went to meet Mrs. Gandhi and said, you don't have any women photographers. And Mrs. Gandhi kind of retorted and said, of course not. We have a woman photographer, a very well known woman photographer called Homai Vyarawalla. It was reported in the Times of India. And, it was a dramatic story because, suddenly somebody read it and came running to their house and said, are you the same Homai Vyarawalla? And she said, yes. And that's how she was discovered again.
So I think she was rediscovered many times, and that is amazing because she kept her spirit right
Yeah.
through. And this is something which this is the first time we went to her house after that lovely meeting in the Baroda Anjuman. She said, "Oh, you have to come and see my cameras, and you have to come and see my negatives." And then she discovered that Dushyant and Hemant were Madan Mahata's grand nephews. And there she is, half her head is cut off. She's showing me her camera, and it is really heavy. She puts the camera together for us. I have never seen a bulb that big. And as you said, she used to have to take out the bulb after every shoot. And she used to carry those bulbs, very ecologically conscious even at that time. She used to carry those bulbs back so that she never littered anything. I think that was the Gandhian Homai which the world must know about. And this was one of her favorite photos. If you look at the back of this little drawing room of hers, of Sardar Patel and Nehru, both together, and she photographed a lot of Nehru and a lot of Sardar Patel. This very house was remarkable because when we went in, we had to pull a rope, and the rope rang a little brass bell at the top of a very windy, flimsy staircase. And there we went up, and there was this lady in this tiny little room. She had owned a house in Hoskas Enclave, which she just gave up when her husband died. And I just shudder to think of what type of money she gave up when she just sold that house after Manik Shah's death and moved away to Pilani. She never looked back. You're absolutely right about that. And in this notebook are all the stories about Homai. Here she is with Dushyant and Hemant Mehta, and that is her box of camera tools. We had to go under beds. We had to climb on top of cupboards to pull out her collection, and it was just unbelievable. And these boys couldn't stop grinning. I call them boys because they, in the world where we travel, everybody used to say, "Are I chokrao," in Gujarati, "I chokrao etlu kare છે આપણી કોમ વાસ્તે, I to આપરો દોરાબ ને હોમી એ લોકોના નામ કરશું." That means these boys are doing so much for our community. We must call them not Dushyant and Hemant, but Dorab and Homi, because they are more than Parsi in what they're doing for the community and recording the community. The next picture is where I asked Sabeena to take over again and talk about her new book on Homai.
Yeah. Yeah. But before that, I want to say that I'll come to that later. But I've also had to become an honorary Parsi, and I will make you all laugh about with that story later. But I will come to that later.
Okay.
Now, I have to say that in 2010, Homai was rediscovered in her when she was in her 80s, right? So there was the film, then there was the book. And in 2010, she had this huge archive of pictures, 100,000 negatives, and she didn't know where to give them. And finally, we decided to give them to the Alkazi collection of photography because we felt that they would take care of the negatives the most. Because you require a certain kind of air conditioning and acid-free covers and all of that in order to preserve this work. This is analog work. Now, when it went to the Alkazi collection of photography, I have to say that Vyarawalla, who's the curator of the Alkazi collection of photography, was amazing. I mean, the person behind this, of course, was Ibrahim Alkazi, who passed away recently, who was this visionary who said that we will look after the collection. He was very kind to Homai. And so we had a series of retrospective exhibitions, 4 exhibitions on Homai, as we digitized. And as we digitized her work and we opened up her work, and the exhibitions traveled from the NGMA in Delhi to Bombay to Bangalore, the space given to what we considered, what Homai had considered to be her important pictures, pictures of mainstream nationalist politics, seemed to be shrinking. Because I was then pulling out other photographs and saying, but these are so interesting. Why did we never look at these? And so I think in some ways the digitization introduced Homai to work that she had made 50 years later, which she had not considered important at all. And I think that one of the things that I think which is very important is that, and this is the subject of the new book, which I will be writing with the Alkazi, with the ACP, is focusing on the 5 years in Bombay before she goes to Delhi, because I do believe now that her move to Delhi prematurely stopped a very interesting part of her work, where she was actually an artist photographer and not just a press photographer. And if you look carefully at these images, you realize that Homai was photographing uh, another part of life very keenly. She was looking at everyday life. She was looking at very intimately at the lives of women, and she was looking at landscape. She was looking at architecture. She was looking at cities, as subjects. And I think that these are very interesting things to look at as well. So while we know her political work, I think it's important to look at that. So this is, of course, the gateway of India during monsoon. This very, very, almost melancholic picture, again in Bombay. And again, the monsoon in Bombay. And, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about this picture and the ones that will follow. So she was photographing at the JJ School of the Arts, and you saw those pictures earlier. And these were, pictures that were sanctioned by the institution. So the JJ School of Arts called her to take pictures of the institution, and that's why you see Rehana Mughal, doing the sculpture. So that and the next picture would be like, so in a spread you'd see it would be a spread on the JJ School of Arts. But these pictures are pictures that she took after she had finished photographing those pictures, when the women wanted her to take almost like privately commissioned forms of portraits, or a kind of it could be seen as a kind of a private form of portraiture, where the women wanted her to take their photographs, where they were posing like film stars. And I think that this synergy between the young photographer and her subjects produced a certain kind of these very affective pictures, where you see them, wanting to show their slender necks, show their bare legs, pose like film stars, at different angles. And these are lovely pictures that you find at the end of that negative jacket. And I do want to say that this would not have been possible without digitization. It's a different moment. if we had, for all these years, Homai had all these negatives in a drawer, in
Yeah.
different drawers, and we could never open them up because we never had the funds to open them up. But the moment you get into digitization allows you to look at an entire volume. You can look at 100 negatives at the same time. So you get a sense of scale, but you can also, with almost like the forensic imagination of a detective, you can zoom into a photograph, which you can't do otherwise. And it allows you then to look at something that appeared that Homai had chosen and what happened before that and what happened after that. In film, I teach film at Jamia. In film, we call this the outtakes. What are the outtakes? They're things that you don't decide to put into the film. So if we were to look at these photographs as outtakes, then I think that these tell a different story. And also, it allows me to pick out photographs that Homai may not have chosen or considered important to print up, but I think that they are very beautiful photographs. So, as a curator, I think that there's a value to these photographs. This one, for instance, taken at the zoo in Bombay, and this one of a young nurse getting ready, as the modern young girl getting ready to go out.
This is a fascinating picture. We all were together in taking Homai's portraits and pictures and the Parzor exhibition across India in 2000. I think this must have been 2007. And suddenly, in the corridor, this lady says, "Come here quickly, come here quickly." And she said, "Can you see me over there?" And we just looked at her. And then we all went running to photograph her. The same girl carrying the stretcher in Kushrubag had now, Bachu Balsara, had now become Bachu Parekh, a very well known Parsi of Calcutta. And she stood before that and proudly had herself photographed. And there are very many pictures of the work Parsi women did during the Second World War, training as nurses, training as Air Force, as air wardens. And there's a lot of spreads of these, and it's all available in that book. And I hope you're going to have many more of these in your next book, Sabeena, also.
In fact, one of the things I want to say is to go back to something that I said earlier that, these were publicly sanctioned images. So these are performed photographs of women doing air rape precaution activities, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, they are, but when I spoke to her, to Bachu, what she remembered of this was this, but she also remembered the bonding and the fun that they had with the friends. So it's also a different, they're also talking about their lives as young women at this point in time, which I find very fascinating.
That's right. Next one, please. Yeah. Would you like to
And she
talk about this?
photographed, yeah,
Yeah.
and she photographed a lot of birthdays. Now, this is a famous birthday, but she photographed birthdays, school functions. Again, not considered, she never considered those important. But today, when we look back, we are very interested in, as a photo historian, I am very interested in photographs of everyday life. And I constantly have people come up to me and say, "This is a photograph taken by Homai," and offer it to me, which I think is wonderful that people then, it becomes like this ongoing archive where people come back and they give you those photographs. And it's got the stamp of Vyarawalla International Photographs, which is the stamp that she and her husband used to put at the back of the picture. Now, this is a very famous family. Of course, you can recognize, you can see Indira Gandhi, but she's not Indira Gandhi here. She's a harried mother, kind of overseeing the birthday party of Sanjay. And of course, she writes this letter thanking her after the photographs are taken. And on the right hand side, you see the little invite which was sent out made by Sanjay and Rajiv, inviting little children for the birthday party. And I think her son, Homai's son Farooq, was also part of this birthday party. So it was a very different moment.
There was one other field of photography which we have discovered recently, and that is people coming back to us and saying, our Navjot photos, our wedding photos in
Yeah.
Delhi were all taken by Homai Vyarawalla.
Yes.
And I'm
Yes.
hoping to be able to get those out after this Friday forum and ask people to at least give them to us so that we can scan them and preserve them.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Next, please. Yeah, Sabeena.
Okay. And again, I began to look at everything very differently. So when I started looking at these pictures, which I hadn't particularly paid much attention to, they speak of something else. Now, this, as I said, there's this great obsession among women that she's photographed. She's got all these dressing up pictures. Now, dressing up is very different from dressing, which is a more utilitarian activity. There is a certain fascination with dressing up. And this whole idea of being fashionable. I think it's a very important cultural phenomena, which I think that is important to talk about. So this is a informal fashion show at the home of the British High Commissioner, where you have all these expatriate women, but also a number of Indian women. And what is so interesting about these pictures is that it's, even though these are elite women, it's such an unspectacular and intimate gathering because it's in the afternoon sun. They're walking on the grass. In some of you, I'm not showing you all the photographs, but in some of them, a dog will just pass by, a stray dog will pass by. You'll see women with their sisters. The next photograph, I think, has two twins.
Yes.
Or you will see women with their daughters. Or you will see there's a lovely picture where a woman is walking with her Dashin, her pet Dashin, and the Dashin's got a coat made of the same fabric that she's wearing. So they're lovely pictures, and these are, these what I call her fashion, her fancy dress and her fashion pictures. But clearly, the women were. We have to remember that the women were comfortable with her. And I think that's something unique to being a woman photographer, that women did not mind. They were not self-conscious in front of her. They liked her being photographed by her.
Sabina, would you like to say something also after this photograph about how she was invited by the expatriate community to show off their homes in India?
Yes, yes. So before I come to this photograph, so a lot of them would, before they left for to go back, they lived in these palatial homes. And one of the things that they wanted her to do always was to photograph their own homes because, back home it was not going to be like that any longer. And so, all these lovely pictures taken of their home so that they could take them back with them and frame them when they went back home, as memories of another home in India. Now, brides of India,
Yes.
women of India. This was I think Shernaz would remember this from your growing up years. I think I was perhaps. It didn't happen in my time, a little later, but it was very much a phenomena of being participating in these competitions where you dressed up in a particular kind of way. And it has to be seen against the backdrop of nationalism. So this was unity, this was a moment of unity and diversity where you had to show diverse people coming together as one, as all being Indian. And this is from the personal collection of Uma Chakravarti, the historian, and she gave me this photograph because her mother is in the photograph, and these are women of Tamil Nadu. But I again like to see this as slightly different. It's very easy. I suppose it would be simple to just look at it as an expression of nationalism. But again, I think that I'm very intrigued by this idea of dressing up. And I think that nationalism doesn't quite explain this urge to dress up. And I think that here is a moment where in Nehruvian India, which was a kaleidoscope of many competing aspirations, both national and personal.
Sabina, I'd like to tell you that even I have taken part in a fashion show. Can you believe that now? And that was in Wellington at the Staff College, where
Yeah.
I think the important part was that the Indian Army maintained the brides of India, the people of India, and all of us used to take great pride that every year, at least once at the club or at the institute, we would have a program which would show, it wasn't called Unity in Diversity, it was just called Us People and Indians all together. And my mother used to, in fact, be in charge of these shows, and her beautiful Cartier sari used to come out and be worn by somebody or the other as the Parsi bride. And
Right.
it was also a time when you were allowed to walk in a very male gaze without feeling at all self-conscious about yourself. And I think that was a very nice part of growing up in India. We were so proud of India.
And here these are two photographs of Homai, and I want to talk a little bit about Homai's own um, presence as a modern young woman photographing. I've talked about the Parsi aspect before this, that, she belonged to the Parsi community and that made a huge difference. I'm sorry, that's my dog, very old dog coughing. So if you're wondering where that sound is coming from, I have a cat in the back and I've got a dog here. So I think that one of the things that was very important to her was to dress in a particular kind of way. I think that her survival in a male dominated arena where she was surrounded by men, both in photography and in politics, her strategy then was to have a very desexualized persona where she dressed in this very non-fussy, she cultivated a very non-fussy sartorial sense. She dressed in a sari. She was friendly and yet she was professional. And I think that is what helped her to survive. The men around her, even those who were younger than her, who were older than her, called her mummy. It was a nickname given to her by a photographer friend called Satakopan. And she says that everybody laughed, but it became a kind of a nickname. And she says, I never said, don't call me mummy. She says, somehow the fact that they called me mummy put me on a pedestal and kept me kind of safe. And I think that this, I think, is an important thing to talk about because it allowed her then, as a woman with the camera, to loiter. Women are not allowed to loiter. Women are not allowed to roam the streets. Women are not allowed to be in public space. But the camera gives her legitimacy, and this persona gives her legitimacy to then be on the streets, to stare, to loiter, to deal with unexpected situations that she may not have been able to do otherwise. And of course, she'd go for all these parties. So this is of course with one of the ambassadors, and everybody knew her, and this is with a colleague who was Japanese.
But I'd like to say over here that it was just, can you go back? After these parties, on her cycle with her sari and her camera, she'd cycle back to Connaught Place at night, sometimes past midnight. Can you imagine cycling in your own locality today as a woman?
Right. Yeah.
Next one, please.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This is when we had the release of the book Camera Chronicles, and Sabeena is talking with Homai next to her. My father was President Parzor, my late father, and he's there. And it was a very special day for us because Homai had asked me, will you make my book? We have to thank the Culture Ministry because they helped us with finances. We have to thank Mappin because they did a wonderful job, especially Paulo Misha. And Homai had a fabulous handwriting. And if you see the cover of the original book, the entire front pages are Homai's letters to myself and to Sabeena. Homai was a Gandhian in many ways. Her letters used to be sent in recycled envelopes much before recycling became fashionable. This is her inscribing a book, and she inscribed in my book, "Thank you, you made my dream come true." So this was something which I feel it was all worth it. It was a very long job. It was a very tough job. Both Sabeena and I know how tough Homai could be. When she was ill, when she was cranky, she used to drive us completely crazy. But I must say, we did the job and she was so happy about it. And that was our reward. This is again at the function, and you can see the same photo that we started with of Gandhiji. We wanted it here today because today is Gandhi Jayanti. And there's another picture there of Jinnah. And we forget that she also photographed Jinnah in very, very many pictures of hers. And it was all part of an archive which tells a story of India's creation. Next, please. This is Diana Khambata, who was a very active member of the Delhi Parsi Anjuman with her late husband. She's now not very well, so unfortunately she can't join us or talk to us about this. But this is Homai and her holding hands because they suddenly realized, well, all those years ago we knew each other so well. And so this is old friends and new, the Parsis of Delhi, who did a Sagan and Tili and things of that sort for Homai at her book launch and at the exhibition. Next one, please. this Sabina has to tell the amazing
Absolutely.
stories which we had, because the Sabina's emails to us were sometimes frantic, sometimes comic, but I just haven't had the time to pull them out. But we have to publish those separately as a book, I think. Sabina, please talk about this and how she wanted, how, first of all, how the American embassy refused to give her a visa to go to America because she was almost 90, or she was 90 already, and then how they gave her a 10-year visa, which we thought was very comic. Please take over.
So, this was in 2008 or 2007 when we went in 2008. I received an invite from Harvard University to come and speak, and I on Homai, and they had no idea that Homai was alive. So when I told them that, they said, "Would she come?" And I said, "I'll find out." And asked her, and she said, "Why not?" And that was not surprising for me because Homai had always been adventurous all her life. Except that after saying that, I gulped because, just the idea of taking a 94-year-old woman across the Atlantic, and Homai had never traveled abroad in her life. This was her first ever trip abroad. So, then there was this whole thing of how we're going to get the visa, how we're going to get medical insurance. And of course, Harvard had very kindly said that they would buy a business class ticket for her. And I would, of course, have to rough it out in club class, ordinary class. And she was able to get her visa, and they were so impressed with her at the American embassy that they gave her a 10-year visa, which was incredible. And then with all the biometrics and all of that, and then we set out. And of course, when we got invited to Harvard, then Chris Spinney, who's a very well-known scholar of photography, said, "Why don't you come to Northwestern University in Chicago?" And then we got an invite from Rosie Thomas at the University of Westminster in London. So we went London, um, Boston, Chicago, London, and then back to Delhi. Now, when we traveled on the plane, it was interesting that, I had been given these dire warnings by everybody saying that, she's going to have thrombosis, she's 94-year-old, make her do exercises, anything can happen on the flight. We go on the flight, and after a while, I was very lucky. I was upgraded to business class by the very, very helpful air hostesses. And after a while, when they realized who she was, even the head stewardess was sitting at our feet, and all the passengers in business class were sitting at our feet looking at the book. And she was regaling everybody with these stories. And then all this, stuff was coming to eat. And of course, Homai was a Gandhian, and she didn't believe in wasting any food. So every time something came and she couldn't finish it, she said, "Finish it." And of course, yours truly had to polish it off. And then she said, the air stewardess said, "Would you like to have white wine or would you have to?" And Homai loved wine. So she said, "I'll have red wine." And so wine came for her. And then she just gave it to me and she said, "Finish it." And I don't drink at all. And I went glug, glug, glug. And after a while, my head was like swimming because, I had never drunk wine like that because I don't drink. And of course, I got a massive migraine after that. And, the rest of the journey was full of migraine. All I remember was this Homai, a sparkling Homai in the next leg, walking up to me, giving me little tidbits to eat. So everything that she didn't want to eat from club class, she'd come back to the economy. I was sitting right at the edge, and she'd come and give it to me, and she'd go away. We reached Boston. I'm like racked by a headache, and Homai is bright and chirpy and, looking around curiously at the landscape. The next day was a bit of a nightmare because the headache continued. Of course, it got better, and then, the talk went off very well. From there, we went to Chicago. We gave a talk in Chicago. And it's interesting that what I imagined that Homai would like was not stuff that she liked. So, for instance, I have a very good friend, Kathy Hansen, who is a South Asianist, and she flew down specially from Texas to take us to see the Chicago skyline. And I still remember we took her to see the Chicago skyline, all those, the Sears Tower and all these tall buildings. And after a while, she looks at me and she's sitting at the back strapped up and she says, "Let's go back. They all look the same." So, okay. And we went back. And the other interesting thing was that, she was everything, in her bag. She had carried all the possible things that she might require on the trip. So in her bag was nutmeg in case she had an upset stomach, rubber glue in case she broke her chappal, and she did, and then she prepared it when she was there. A grater to grate apple. She was horrified at the quantity of food served in America. We all know what American helpings can be like. And every time she said how wasteful this is. Look at the big glass of water. Look at the big glass of juice. I mean, this is ridiculous. And because she is a Gandhian and she just did not believe in wasting anything. And of course, I have to say that everywhere there were Parsis because everybody had heard about Homai, and in every city, Parsis would come to meet Auntie Homai. And after a while, I kind of gave up trying to explain who I was and why I was doing the book. And they all said, "You're Parsi." And I said, "Yes, I'm Parsi." And of course, it helps that I have a long nose. I have the Parsi nose. So I became Parsi. So I've become an honorary Parsi. And they came with food for her, and it was just amazing. And then we reached London. And I think that London really appealed to her because when we had reached Heathrow, on the leg when we were going to the US. We had got off at Heathrow, and I've been very curious about what she would think of. It was her first trip to England. Remember, she had worked for the British, and her employers had been these very dynamic and hardworking people. And I wondered what she would think of Heathrow. So we got off at the terminal, and it was a kind of a seedy part of the terminal, and we had to change planes. And there were about 25 Indians waiting for wheelchairs. Of course, we know that's a familiar sight. And Homai did not require a wheelchair. Even at 94, she was standing straight and she said, "I don't need a wheelchair." And so we waited and waited and waited and waited till the buggy came to take us. And after a while, she got very tired and she walked up to this woman who was in charge and she said, "Madam, this does not speak very well for British efficiency," because it was so different from the world of the British that she had seen as their employee. When we came to London, she really liked London. And I think part of it was the fact that she could see people because Chicago and Boston were these beautiful spaces, where we were living, but they were not, there was nobody on the streets. Whereas London was crowded, it felt more like home. And I think that our conversation at Westminster, the photograph that you see here, had a completely different energy because of a shared colonial past and a history. And so it was a very interactive session. I still remember she had people like laughing all the time. She talked about how and of course, we are two women separated by 50 years. And so, sometimes our stories would be contradictory. So for instance, she said, I shared everything with my husband 50-50. And I said, "But why didn't he wake up at 4:30 in the morning to, fetch the milk?" And she gave me a tap on my head. And then she made everybody laugh. And she said, "I'm a bachelor girl now." And, everybody laughed. So she was like a highlight of that evening. And she was just amazing. And then we came back, and I have to say that you will see a little bit of that in the clip of a film that I will show you at the end. But I want to end with that because we came back, and I had this little handy cam with which I was shooting her, and I asked her at the end of the trip. I said, "Mrs. Vyarawalla, what did you think of the trip?" And she said it was all right. And I was really disappointed. I thought to myself, so did she not enjoy it? And there were all these questions in my head. Then something, there was a memory that got sparked in my head. I had taken her on the hop on, hop off bus in London. And I do remember that every time we'd go to these different places, as we were traveling in the bus, she'd slowly nod off, and she'd be a little noddy and she'd be nodding away. And that was a perfectly legit way to deal with all the different time zones that we had been through. And then suddenly she'd wake up with a start and she'd say Leicester Square, or she'd say Trafalgar Square. And something, I'd wonder, like, how does she know this? And I think that what I realized was that Homai Vyarawalla, even though she may not have physically traveled, she read, she watched television, and she was a global traveler even without physically traveling. She had traveled in her head. And so it didn't matter whether it was the right time or the wrong time, but she had already traveled in some ways. And it was really, this was a particular generation of cosmopolitan people who were different. And I think Homai was one of those.
This is, of course, after Homai passed away. We had a memorial meeting at the Delhi Parsi Anjuman, and Mr. Trilochan Singh was then the president of the Parzor Foundation, and Yazid Kapadia was the president of the Delhi Parsi Anjuman. And it was, in some ways, a sad day. In some ways, she'd got the Padma Vibhushan, she'd got her book. I think she'd led a very satisfied and not happy, but a satisfied life. And as a professional, I think she had achieved whatever she wanted. And the wonderful thing is that her photographs and Sabeena have made her live on, and we hope the next book also will continue her legacy. Can we see the? This, of course, was Madan Mahata, whom I talked about right in the beginning. He came and he spoke. Dushyant, who has grown a little bigger, like I have over the years, we knew Homai. And Madan brought his camera. And of course, Homai used to always talk about her Sardarji. Her Sardarji was Ajit Singh at the Mahata studio, who used to repair her cameras, help her out with lots of things. So the Mahata link with Homai was quite incredible, and we never knew it was going to happen. So there's a synergy in things which happen for a good cause. Next, please.
So before I
Sabeena,
speak
take
about this
over, please.
photograph,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to. Before I speak about this photograph, I just want to read out the last paragraph from the book, because you said, you talked about a happy life and then you kind of corrected yourself. She did have a happy life. I want to say that. So I'm just going to read out. I said, what do you think will come tomorrow? She says, I don't bother about that. I live for the present. I don't think too much about what has passed, even if it was bad. It has been done and done with completely. No emotions swell. I'm not a very emotional person. I don't go on. Oh, I've lost my husband. I've lost my son. God gave me everything when the going was good. It was very nice. As they say, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. I've had that experience of having a good, loving family, and when it's gone, I'm leading a different life now. I have my hobbies, and I have learned so much doing things on my own by depending on myself that I do things I have never done before. So, this is another phase of life to enjoy. And I think what I would see Homai is somebody who lived life to the full. And even though life was unkind to her, I mean, imagine losing a son when he was 48. She still lived life after that. She lived for so many decades after that. And she lived well. She would, make food for herself. She'd bake, she'd cook, she'd, do things. She'd keep herself occupied. She was an amazing woman, and I consider myself to be absolutely privileged to have known her for 15 years of my life. Now, this photograph was taken on the last time I met her. I decided to give her a surprise on the 9th of December 2011, which was her birthday. And I just landed up in Baroda without telling her. And then I said to myself, old people don't like getting these nasty surprises. So I sent her a text message from the plane saying that I've come to Baroda and I'm going to see you tomorrow. This was on the 8th of December. And she had by now, because she was hard of hearing, she had learned with help to read SMS. So she was really tech savvy. And so I went to her the next day. We had a lovely day. So I remember some people came over. We went to buy a new TV. She didn't like anything. So we spent we spent that time in the store being wheeled around. And of course, she never bought it. And we came back. And in the evening, some friends came over. This is taken by a very dear friend who actually tragically passed away himself, Johannes Manjrekar in Baroda. And I gave her this little lamp because this was the only thing that I could think of giving her. And she's holding this lamp. The next morning, I took a little interview with her before I left for the airport, and I, just talked to her. And she said she spoke of her body as a kind of a. She spoke of herself as living in a disobedient and ailing body that she described as a broken house. But she said the spirit in that body is still young. And I'm going to end with a clip. The reason why I'm ending with the clip is not just because it is from the film that I made as a tribute to her after she passed away, but at the end of the clip, you will see this forever young, extraordinary Homai Vyarawalla from, it's an archival clip, which I believe it's mine, even though it's borrowed from a film called The British Empire in Color. You will see why I have used this clip at the end. So, the forever, eternally young Homai Vyarawalla. And if you can have the sound up.
Yeah. And yeah. Just take me off the screen, please.
Yeah, Shernaz can be taken off the screen.
Yeah, just take me off the screen. Thank you so much,
I
Sabina.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, I just wanted to say that this is actually Homai traveling through different landscapes. So, Delhi, then she goes to Boston, then from Boston to Chicago, from Chicago to London. And then, of course, in the end, I hope everybody caught that little glimpse of this woman in the white sari, which is how I like to remember her as this eternally young Homai Vyarawalla, moving across the frame of history because, this is the day of India's independence, the 15th of August. The swearing in ceremony has just got over. And in the middle of all this pageantry, you see this ordinary woman run across, who is not spoken about in history, but such an important figure.
Thank you so much, Sabina. And we look forward to your book and another session with you when that book comes out. And thank you, all of you, for joining us. We've run completely out of time, as I knew we would. And please do join us again. If you have any questions, do ask us right now. But otherwise, do join us next week. And we'll have another Friday forum, which will be interesting. But of course, Homai's story is very special to both of us and I think to lots of people. Thank you, Sabina. And thank you,
Thank you.
Matab. Thank you, Kritika. You all have
Yes,
done
definitely.
wonders. Yeah, you've done wonders,
Yes.
especially Matab. 5 minutes before we started, we went live. She was still doing things for us. Thank you so much. Thanks,
Thank you so
Sabina.
much.
God bless.
Thank you, both of you.